Hey everybody, today I wanted to go through some frequently asked questions that are coming up in the members area of the School of Clinical Leadership program. So this is obviously going to be available for program members, but I wanted to make this Q&A available to other people because these are questions that also come up on my free webinar that kind of gives the overview of what's in the School of Clinical Leadership. So I'm going to get started here and just go through some of the most common questions that I get on both the webinar, which is really people who are interested in learning about executive functioning, whether it be for their students, for themselves, or whether it be for their kids. And also just some of the questions that are coming up for the people who have invested in the School of Clinical Leadership program and are really working on developing their own programming for their direct intervention as it pertains to executive functioning, and also trying to get some of that programming in place in their school buildings and possibly in their private practice. So I'm going to go through a couple things. The top questions that I get that I wanted to cover today are, number one, what is front loading? Because I use that term frequently and I get asked about it frequently. Just what is it and how does it apply to this situation? I also get questions about how you might fade prompting. And I think there's a lot of confusion about this because in my free webinar, I do say things like, just that you can't reward or punish a child into doing skills that they don't have. But at the same time, we don't want to be constantly prompting kids and acting as their executive functioning. And so I think people struggle to figure out what's the balance in between that, because on one end, we don't want to just keep things completely unstructured. We know that many students need explicit instruction in things like language and executive functioning. We need to directly teach these skills in order for students with neurodevelopmental differences to learn a lot of these skills, especially if we know that they're struggling. But at the same time, we know that if we're constantly prompting and pulling information out of them or reminding them what step they need to do next and essentially solving all their problems for them, they're not ever going to develop those skills. So I wanted to tease out some examples and walk through a framework that you can use to think about this, and then also address some frequently asked questions that come up as it pertains to that scaffolding and fading prompting. Just kind of talking through some examples that might come up in the home setting because you might be somebody who is coaching parents, and then also how it might present in a school situation, and then talk about how we can support both parents and teachers who are working through those types of situations. So I'll start off by giving the definition of front loading as I understand it and the way that I use it, because there's many different ways. Really, front loading is doing the work up front. So for example, I used to use the term front loading when I was in college, because when I had a big paper due at the end of the semester, what I liked to do was front load and get a lot of it done at the beginning and give myself a due date well before it was actually due, because I liked to play around with the draft, and it would cause me a lot of anxiety to wait till the last minute. And that would really stress me out. So what I had to do was make a deadline and plan and prepare up front. So again, front load, I would load the work up front in order to be more prepared. Now, many other people don't work that way. They really need to feel that deadline looming. And so they may wait way longer. But what I liked to do was think about how I could prepare up front for a situation that was coming up in the future. Now, that's one way that you might hear the word front loading used. And I would say the concept of how you might use front loading in terms of working on executive functioning with children and with young adults is similar, but I'm going to clarify how it might be a little bit different depending on the context. So again, it's really about planning and preparing. So what we're doing when we're front loading is your kids that you're supporting have situations that are happening in their lives. So they might have specific events that are coming up. And what we want to do is do something with them, have a planning session with them to give them information, allow them to run through the task and practice, teach them skills, and give them what they need in order to increase their chances of being successful in whatever the situation is that's coming up, which is also going to help manage their anxiety. So again, there's a big relationship between executive dysfunction and anxiety. Of course, anxiety can exist for other reasons, but a lot of times executive dysfunction and not feeling prepared causes anxiety. So that can be really powerful if we are working with students to plan and prepare and give them information so they know what's coming and help kind of visualize and paint that picture for them using a number of different methods. And that does really help with anxiety because a lot of times people feel anxious because they're not prepared. Kind of going back to why I used to front load for myself. So I don't have ADHD, but I do have some anxiety about unknowns. And I used to, even though my anxiety wasn't stemming from executive dysfunction, what I would use is my executive functioning skills to help manage my own anxiety by preparing up front, knowing that I had the work done, knowing that I had blocked out time for what if something goes wrong? What if this draft that I'm working on takes me longer? What if I get sick and I'm not able to work on it when I thought I was going to work on it? And I would think about all those different kinds of things. And if I waited till, closer to the deadline, I would get stressed out and it would cause me a lot of anxiety. So using that method of planning and preparing and using my own executive functioning skills, I would manage my anxiety. So going back to why we might do it for students. So some students might not necessarily be thinking like I was. Maybe they're not engaging their executive functioning skills because they're not developed yet. And in that situation, the anxiety might come later for them. It might come in the when they're in that situation or when that deadline is more when they're closer to that deadline because they're realizing, oh my gosh, I'm not prepared and I haven't prepared up until this point. And so within that situation, it causes them anxiety because it feels, again, they don't necessarily feel prepared. And then maybe the situation might not go as well because they didn't prepare. Whereas, for me, I had that anxiety well before. So it was different, but in either situation, front loading is a very effective tool for managing that anxiety, whether it's because we need to teach those executive functioning skills or whether it's because your executive functioning is already going and you're thinking about all the potential things that could go wrong, which is what I tend to do. I'm kind of on the polar opposite of that end. So again, front loading is about planning and preparing. So let me give you a couple specific contexts. So the way that I often teach my time journal strategy to therapists and clinicians that are working in the schools is that I give a writing task as an example of a situation where a school clinician, for example, could front load and prepare their student for a writing assignment that might have to be done in their class. And this might be something that's coming up, that's a one-time thing that we know is coming, or it might be something like maybe it's an ongoing thing that happens every week and the student is struggling and we need to prepare for that ongoing thing. So at a very high level, how that would look in a school situation is that maybe in that smaller group, what you're doing is that you're taking the student aside and you're practicing how they might do research and take notes for writing and go through that preparation process, which is overwhelming and might be difficult for students to learn in that bigger class. So you're front loading by teaching those skills up front in a smaller group where you can give students attention. You might be modeling how students can watch the clock and kind of map out how they're going to spend their time. So you might have an analog clock and you might be shading in different parts and say, okay, for this 15 minutes, we're going to be doing some research and then we're going to be doing our outline and kind of map out time and model how students might be able to look back at that clock and remind them to be checking for the time. We might model self-talk and encourage students to ask themselves questions. So we might be modeling and practicing that in this smaller group because that's something that we'd want students to take over to the classroom. We might be talking about the situation that's coming up. Okay, we've practiced this strategy and we've walked through how you would do this research paper when you go to class. Let's think about how that's going to look when we go into the classroom. So that might be another way that you could front load and how front loading could look. And that might be a series of sessions. That might be something that you do in your therapy session. If you're a special ed teacher or an SLP or other support personnel, reading specialist, or really anybody who's supporting students, this could be a way that you front load for writing. And then maybe you're collaborating with the teacher and you're talking about what you're doing in your small group and then how you're going to transfer that over to the large group to help students remember to retrieve the strategies. Maybe you've talked to the teacher about what you've done in your small group, and then the teacher might have some, they might be modeling self-talk in the classroom, or they might have some different ways that they're going to talk with students about, reminding them to use their strategies and watch the clock and think about how to ask themselves questions. So maybe you've already talked to the teacher about that, and that's how you might collaborate and front load for a situation that's coming up. I've also used this strategy for preparing students for recess in a previous podcast episode where I talk about executive functioning paradigm shifts for school teams. I talked about an example of how we might front load for a student who is going outside to recess and needs some support interacting with peers during an unstructured time. And so that's an example for a younger student, but you may have some other situations for older students, whether it's the lunchroom or maybe it's some other unstructured passing period, or maybe it's a class in school where you've got to do a lot of unstructured group work. Maybe it's an extracurricular activity that they're doing, or it could even be like a vocational setting for an older student. So number of different ways you can front load, but what it really is planning, preparing, teaching skills, giving information, and this can be kind of an ongoing process. So there's kind of the front loading, going and doing the real life task in the less structured situation to give some application, and then some reviewing. And so ideally we want to have a mix of all of those things when we're working on executive functioning, because we want to make sure that we're not going too far in either direction. I've heard people who are like, you know what, the best way for people to learn is just to kind of let them figure it out, which of course we need to give kids the opportunity to figure it out. But many students, if they don't have those skills, then it's going to be really frustrating for them to just figure it out. So we do need to give them some explicit instruction. And that's what those front loading sessions can be for. That's where you can start to teach some of those strategies. But then we don't stop there. We don't stop with that structured setting. We give the practice in the structured setting, and then we always have a method for, all right, how are we going to create a situation for the student to actually apply those skills? These things need to work together, and that's how we can avoid going too far in one direction or the other, is that we have this multiple models that we're using. So with front loading, it doesn't have to be a formal therapy session. It can be something really quick, like maybe just a quick conversation that a teacher is having with the student. Like as you're kind of walking through class, it can just be a quick reminder. And that might be something that you're able to do eventually when maybe your student has had some practice with these skills in a smaller group. Maybe it can be just a really quick conversation, like maybe the teaching assistant just has a really quick check-in with some students before you start the assignment in class or before you walk out to the lunchroom or whatever it is. So again, the concept of front loading can be used in many different ways, but we want to think about it as giving our students a chance to prepare. One other thing that it can be really powerful is if we are doing role play strategically. Again, remember that the role play is not the be all end all. So I've seen people use role play as a strategy where they just role play a situation and it's like a social situation in their therapy session, and then they just leave it and then they don't take it a step further and actually apply it to real life. But when you use role play in the context of front loading, it actually can be really helpful. Adults do this all the time. For example, I was interviewing for a job in the last couple of years. And so what did I do before I interviewed? Well, I had a mock interview. I did a practice run with somebody. What do you do before you give a big presentation? Well, you might present to some peers and they give you feedback. So, what are you going to do if you have to, I guess we said the presentation, we said the interview, maybe even if you have to have a difficult conversation. Another example that I could give is that social workers and other clinicians sometimes have to do a technique called motivational interviewing with clients. It's a method that they can use to work through different types of distorted thinking and make some different mindset shifts. And it can be really difficult to learn how to do that when you're on the spot with somebody. It's an emotional situation. So the training for motivational interviewing usually means doing practice runs with other people. So for example, there might be one person over here who's pretending to be the client and is objecting to what they're saying, and then the other person is practicing, and then there's people giving them feedback. So that's another way that we could front load in a structured situation, do a mock run, a mock conversation. Even if it's something that's not academic, you can do a test run there to practice your skills. And then of course you want to go and have real experiences, but you do those mock runs and those dress rehearsals or role plays to give you some practice before you do the real thing. And it does help to ease anxiety. It helps build skills, and it can be an important part of the process. Another example of what we can do for kids, I know that sometimes if kids are going to go to a different place that they've never gone to before, like maybe they have their first soccer game, like it could be good to take them to the soccer field beforehand and let them see what the soccer field looks like and kind of talk through what it's actually going to look like. That can be really powerful because if students are having a difficult time visualizing the future, if you actually go there and let them see what it's like, that's an opportunity to create that visualization. And then when you're back home, you can kind of talk back and, work on episodic memory and go back to, all right, remember what we saw when we went to the soccer field. So those are all kinds of ways that we can front load. Okay, so that kind of outlines how we want to think about that scaffolding, but